My name is Alina Whitmore. I am 68 years old, a widow, and for most of my life I believed something very simple: that family was the one place where you were always safe. I believed the life my husband Edward and I built together would protect me in my later years, not become the very reason someone would try to destroy me. But the night everything changed began like a celebration, quiet and carefully planned. And if anyone had seen it from the outside, they would have thought it was nothing more than a daughter trying to reconnect with her mother, not the beginning of something far darker than I could have imagined. The invitation came about a week before my birthday. Samantha called me late in the evening, her voice unusually bright, almost too rehearsed to feel natural. She spoke quickly, telling me that she and her husband, Brian, had restored the old family cabin in Montana and wanted me to spend my birthday there. She said it would be special, that it was time for us to come together again, and for a moment I allowed myself to believe her. That cabin had once been filled with life. Edward and I had celebrated anniversaries there, shared quiet mornings by the lake, watched Samantha grow from a child into a young woman. After Edward passed away, I couldn't bring myself to return. The memories were too strong, the silence too heavy, and I had convinced myself that some places are better left untouched. But when Samantha asked, something inside me shifted, because a mother's hope doesn't fade easily, even after years of distance. And I found myself saying yes before I had fully thought it through, not realizing that this decision would lead me directly into something carefully planned. The drive to Montana felt longer than I remembered. Brian was behind the wheel, focused, silent, his hands steady in a way that felt controlled rather than calm. Samantha sat beside him, filling the space with light conversation, talking about small things that didn't really matter. She mentioned a dress she had bought, a trip a friend had taken, random details that sounded more like distractions than genuine conversation. What she didn't do was ask about me. She didn't ask how I had been, how I was coping, how the years since Edward's passing had treated me. I noticed that absence, but I chose not to dwell on it. Instead, I told myself that maybe this was her way of reconnecting, that not everyone knows how to bridge distance in the right way, and sometimes effort comes out awkwardly. But even as I told myself that, something inside me felt unsettled, a quiet unease I couldn't fully explain, and as the road narrowed and the trees grew denser around us, that feeling only deepened. When we finally arrived, the cabin looked both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. The structure was the same, but everything about it felt arranged. The porch had been freshly painted, the windows polished until they reflected the fading light, the steps reinforced and cleaned. It looked less like a home and more like a picture of one, something prepared for display rather than lived in. Inside, the table was already set with fine china I hadn't seen in years, plates carefully arranged, candles flickering in the corners. The soft light cast shadows along the walls, shadows that moved slightly as the flames danced. And for a moment, I stood there taking it all in, trying to match what I was seeing with the memories I carried, and realizing they didn't quite align. Samantha handed me a small box, smiling as she told me it was my birthday gift. Inside was a silver locket, delicate and beautifully made. I opened it slowly, expecting to find a photograph, something personal, something meaningful. But it was empty. No picture, no engraving, nothing inside it at all, just a hollow space. I smiled anyway, thanked her, and closed it carefully, but something about that emptiness stayed with me longer than it should have, because it felt symbolic in a way I couldn't ignore, and I found myself wondering why a gift meant to represent closeness felt so distant instead. Dinner began quietly. The table looked perfect: roasted chicken, fresh bread, wine poured into crystal glasses, but something about the atmosphere felt wrong. It wasn't obvious, not something I could point to directly, but it was there, sitting beneath the surface like something waiting to reveal itself. Brian poured the wine with exaggerated care, watching the glass as if the act itself mattered more than anything else. When I took a sip, the taste caught me off guard. It was bitter, metallic, not quite right. I didn't react immediately. I set the glass down, telling myself it was probably nothing, but the feeling didn't leave me, and as the minutes passed, the tension in the room only grew stronger. Samantha avoided my eyes. She spoke when necessary, but her voice felt flat, disconnected, like she was following a script she no longer believed in. Brian, on the other hand, seemed calm in a way that didn't match the situation. He smiled when appropriate, nodded at the right moments, but there was something behind it, something controlled, something that felt deliberate. And as I sat there, surrounded by a setting that looked perfect but felt wrong, I began to understand something I hadn't wanted to admit before, that this night wasn't what it appeared to be, and whatever was coming next had already been decided long before I arrived. The heat in the cabin began to rise slowly at first. The fire in the hearth crackled louder than I remembered, the flames growing higher, stronger, casting more intense shadows across the room. I stood up, intending to open a window, but when I reached for the latch, it wouldn't move. I tried again, applying more pressure, but it stayed locked in place. That was when Brian stood, excusing himself casually as if nothing was out of the ordinary, and stepped outside. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and for a moment everything went still. Then I heard it. The sound was unmistakable, metal scraping against wood, a bolt sliding into place. I turned slowly, my heart beginning to pound in a way that felt different from fear, more like realization catching up with truth. Samantha was sitting exactly where I had left her, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her shoulders rigid. Her eyes were wet, but she didn't move, she didn't speak, she didn't try to stop what was happening, and in that moment I understood something that hurt more than anything else could have. She knew, she had known all along. Through the window, I saw Brian's face appear, illuminated by a growing orange glow. The fire behind me had begun to spread faster than I had anticipated, flames catching onto the curtains, climbing the walls with frightening speed. He leaned slightly closer to the glass, his expression calm, almost gentle, and then he said something that would stay with me forever. "I hope you like fire." The words didn't sound angry, they didn't sound rushed, they sounded certain. The bolt slid fully into place, and suddenly the room was no longer a cabin, it was a trap. The flames spread quickly, consuming everything they touched. Heat rolled across the floor, rising with terrifying speed, smoke filling the air until every breath became a struggle. I rushed to the door, pounding against it with everything I had, but it didn't move. I shouted, called Samantha's name, begged her to do something, anything, but she didn't respond. She just sat there, frozen, her silence louder than the fire itself, and in that moment I realized this wasn't an accident, it wasn't panic, it wasn't something out of control. This was planned, deliberate, and meant to end with me. The smoke thickened, burning my throat, my lungs, making it harder to think clearly. The walls I once filled with memories were disappearing in front of me, photographs curling into ash, furniture cracking under the heat. Every second felt shorter than the last, every breath more difficult than the one before, and just as the panic began to take hold, something else broke through it, something unexpected, something I hadn't thought about in years. Edward's voice. Clear, steady, certain, always know your way out. The memory hit me with such force that it cut through everything else. Years ago, he had shown me something hidden in this cabin, something he insisted on building despite my laughter at the time. I had thought it unnecessary, overly cautious. But now, standing there with fire closing in around me, I understood exactly why he had done it, and for the first time since the flames began to rise, I realized something that changed everything. This wasn't where my story ended. It was where it truly began. The smoke was getting thicker with every second, pressing in from all sides, turning the air heavy and difficult to breathe. The heat wasn't just around me anymore, it was everywhere, crawling up the walls, spreading across the ceiling, closing in like it had a purpose. My lungs burned, my vision blurred, but through all of it, that memory stayed sharp, louder than the crackling of the fire itself. Edward's voice didn't feel like something from the past. It felt present, urgent, guiding me through the chaos. He had always been like that, calm even when things didn't make sense, always thinking ahead, always preparing for things no one else expected. And now I understood that what I once thought was unnecessary caution was the only reason I still had a chance. I forced myself to move away from the door, even though every instinct told me to keep fighting it. The flames had already reached the frame, licking at the wood, making it impossible to get close without risking everything. My eyes scanned the room through the haze, trying to see past the smoke, trying to remember exactly where Edward had shown me that hidden exit all those years ago. It wasn't obvious. It had never been meant to be, that was the point. A safety built into the cabin, disguised so well that anyone who didn't know about it would never think to look. And even as the fire roared louder behind me, I realized something that sent a chill through me despite the heat. Brian didn't know it existed. I moved toward the back wall, coughing as the smoke thickened, my hand trailing along the wooden panels until I felt it. A slight difference in texture, almost impossible to notice unless you were looking for it. My fingers pressed against it, searching for the small latch Edward had shown me, the one hidden so carefully it blended into the grain of the wood. For a moment, I couldn't find it, panic rising in my chest as the flames crept closer, but then my hand shifted slightly and there it was. I pressed it firmly and a quiet click echoed beneath the roar of the fire. The panel loosened just enough to give way, and as I pulled it open, a narrow passage revealed itself, dark, tight, but real. I didn't hesitate. There was no time to think, no time to question anything. I stepped inside, pulling the panel closed behind me as best as I could, sealing myself into the hidden space. The air inside was cooler, clearer, just enough to breathe without choking, and for a brief second I leaned against the wall, letting my body catch up with what was happening. But that second didn't last long because I knew something else just as clearly as I knew I had survived the fire. This wasn't over, not even close, because escaping the cabin wasn't the end of what had been planned for me. It was only the beginning of something they thought had already succeeded. The passage was narrow, forcing me to move slowly, carefully, my hands brushing against rough wood as I made my way forward. It felt longer than I remembered, stretching further than it should have, but that might have been the fear, the adrenaline, the weight of everything pressing in at once. Behind me, I could hear the fire growing louder, stronger, consuming the cabin piece by piece, and the realization hit me with a clarity that was almost surreal. By the time anyone arrived, there would be nothing left. No evidence. No questions, just a tragic accident, a story simple enough to accept without looking deeper, and that was exactly what Brian had intended. When I reached the end of the passage, I pushed against the second panel, feeling it give way after a moment of resistance. Cool night air rushed in as I stepped out into the forest behind the cabin, the sudden contrast making me gasp. The rain had started again, heavier now, soaking the ground, dampening the edges of the fire's reach, but not enough to stop it completely. I stumbled forward, putting distance between myself and the cabin, my legs unsteady but moving, driven by something stronger than exhaustion. And when I finally turned back, what I saw confirmed everything I had already begun to understand. The cabin was fully engulfed. Flames climbed into the sky, bright against the darkness, smoke rising in thick waves that blurred everything around it. It looked final, absolute, like nothing could have survived inside it. And standing at a distance, partially shielded by the trees, I saw Brian. He was watching it burn, his posture relaxed, his attention fixed on the destruction like it was something he had been waiting to see. For a moment, I wondered if Samantha was with him, if she was standing somewhere nearby, watching the same fire, but I couldn't see her. And that absence felt just as heavy as her silence inside the cabin, because it confirmed something I hadn't wanted to accept fully until now. This wasn't just his plan, it was theirs. I stayed hidden, barely daring to breathe, because the moment he saw me, everything would change again, and I didn't know what he would do next. But as I watched him, something became clear. He wasn't searching. He wasn't checking. He wasn't worried. He believed it was over. Completely. And that belief was my advantage, because as long as he thought I was gone, I had something he didn't. Time. When he finally turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness beyond the trees, I didn't move immediately. I stayed exactly where I was, letting the minutes pass, letting the reality settle in around me. The fire continued to burn, consuming what was left of the life I had once known, and as I stood there watching it, I felt something shift inside me. Not fear, not grief, something sharper, clearer, because what had just happened wasn't something I could ignore or walk away from. It wasn't something that could be explained or forgiven. It was deliberate, calculated, and meant to end my life, and the fact that I was still standing there meant something else just as important. They had failed. The rain grew heavier, beginning to push against the fire, slowing it just enough to keep it from spreading beyond the cabin. The sound of sirens in the distance broke through the noise, faint at first but growing louder with each passing second. Someone must have seen the flames, called it in, set the official story into motion. I knew what that story would be before it was even told. An elderly woman alone in a remote cabin, caught in an accidental fire. Tragic, unavoidable, no reason to question it further, and for most people that would be enough. They would accept it, move on, forget it ever happened, but I wasn't most people, and I wasn't gone. I stepped back further into the shadows as the first emergency vehicles approached, their lights cutting through the darkness, reflecting off the rain, turning the entire scene into something almost unreal. Firefighters moved quickly, doing what they could, but it was already too late for the cabin. It would burn down to its foundation just as planned. What they wouldn't find was me, and that was the one detail that changed everything, because while they documented what they believed to be the end of my story, I was standing just beyond their sight, watching the beginning of something entirely different. I didn't step forward, I didn't call out, not yet, because timing mattered, and right now the most important thing wasn't proving I was alive, it was understanding exactly what had been done and why. Because people don't go to this level of effort without a reason, and whatever that reason was, it didn't end with the fire, it started with it. And as I turned away from the burning cabin and moved deeper into the forest, one thought settled into my mind with absolute certainty. They believed they had erased me, but all they had really done was give me the chance to see everything clearly for the first time. And now that I could see it, I wasn't going to let it end the way they planned. By the time the fire was reduced to smoldering ruins, the story had already taken shape. I didn't need to hear it from anyone to know what they would say: an unfortunate accident, an elderly woman alone in a cabin. A tragedy no one could have prevented. It was simple, believable, and most importantly, convenient. And that convenience was exactly what Brian had been counting on, because the easier a story is to accept, the less likely anyone is to question it. But what he didn't account for was the one thing that changed everything: I was still alive. I didn't reveal myself that night. Instead, I stayed hidden, watching from a distance as the authorities moved through the scene, documenting what they believed to be the end of my life. It felt strange, almost unreal, seeing it unfold that way, knowing that I was standing just beyond their reach while they worked under an entirely different truth. But that distance gave me something I hadn't had before: clarity. Without fear clouding my thoughts, without pressure forcing me to react, I could finally see the situation for what it was. This hadn't been an impulsive act. It had been planned carefully, executed with confidence, and designed to leave nothing behind. And that meant there was a reason strong enough to justify it in their minds, something bigger than anger or resentment, something worth risking everything for. I made my way down the narrow forest trail until I reached the main road, my clothes damp from the rain, my body still shaking from everything that had happened. The night was quiet except for the distant echo of sirens fading behind me, and for a moment I allowed myself to stop, to breathe, to take in the reality of where I was. I had escaped something that was meant to end me, something that had been decided long before I arrived at that cabin. And now, standing there alone in the dark, I understood something with absolute certainty: going back to the life I had before wasn't an option anymore, because that life had already been erased. I found help a few miles down the road, a passing driver who didn't ask too many questions, just enough to understand that I needed to get somewhere safe. I gave a name that wasn't mine, an address that wouldn't lead back to me, because I wasn't ready to step back into the world they believed I had left behind. Not yet. There was too much I didn't know, too many pieces that didn't fit together, and until I understood the full picture, revealing myself would only put me back in danger. Because if they were willing to go this far once, there was no reason to believe they wouldn't try again. In the days that followed, I stayed out of sight, watching quietly, listening carefully, letting the truth begin to surface in small, revealing ways. News of the fire spread quickly, just as I expected. The reports were brief, factual, and entirely wrong. They spoke about me in past tense, about a life that had already been concluded, and it felt strange hearing it that way, like I had become a story instead of a person. But that story worked in my favor, because as long as the world believed I was gone, I had something they didn't expect: freedom to move, to think, to plan without being seen. What I uncovered in those quiet days confirmed everything I had begun to suspect. There were financial changes already in motion, documents prepared in advance, decisions made that only made sense if my death had been expected. This hadn't just been about removing me, it had been about what came after. And the deeper I looked, the clearer it became that Brian wasn't acting alone. Samantha's silence in that cabin hadn't been fear, it had been agreement. And that realization settled into me with a weight that didn't come with anger anymore, but with something colder, something more focused, because understanding the truth doesn't always bring emotion, it brings direction. I didn't rush to confront them, I didn't call, didn't show up, didn't give them any indication that their plan had failed. Instead, I prepared, quietly, carefully, the same way they had. Because this wasn't about reacting anymore, it was about responding in a way that ensured there would be no second attempt, no unfinished outcome. They had built their plan on the assumption that I wouldn't survive. And now I was building mine on the certainty that I had. Weeks later, I stood at a distance outside the home they believed was now entirely theirs, watching as life continued around them like nothing had changed. They moved freely, spoke easily, carried on with the quiet confidence of people who thought they had succeeded. And as I stood there, observing everything they thought was secure, I realized something that brought everything into focus. The night at the cabin wasn't the end of my story, it was the moment they wrote themselves into it. And now that I was still here, still watching, still understanding every piece they thought was hidden, one truth became impossible to ignore. They had planned my ending very carefully, but they never planned for what would happen next, because the person they tried to erase was the only one who knew exactly how their story would truly end.